I guess while we get started, panelists, if y'all would like to introduce yourself, I think now is a good time.
Okay, Ken, since you're the moderator.
Oh, sure. I can go first. Yeah, sorry. I was scrambling to unmute myself. Hi, everybody. My name is Ken Paulman. I am the director of the Energy News Network. We are exactly what we sound like. ENN's been around for 10 years, and we are part of a nonprofit public policy organization. We're editorially independent, but we have been part of Fresh Energy, which has been around for 30 years now. And so this topic of foundation fundraising is something that comes very naturally to our organization. Almost all of our money comes from foundations. And our goal here is to have a free-flowing conversation. We've got some tee-up questions, but we want to have this be as organic as we can. So feel free to throw questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to those towards the end. So Tracy, did you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Tracy Powell. I am the program officer with the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund at Borealis Philanthropy. Before that, I worked with Democracy Fund and the Public Square with the Public Square Initiative, and been a journalist all my life. And it feels really, really strange to be on this side of the conversation. I'm usually asking funders for money. I guess I am, but this is this is my first time as a funder, so this will be interesting but weird.
Terry, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm Terry Quinn. I'm the Chief Development Officer for the Texas Tribune. I've been with the Tribune for about 6 years, or over 6 years, and this is my 23rd year in fundraising. So from the nonprofit world rather than the journalism world, but it's been a great marriage of both worlds together.
Great. And I see Candace is here. Candace, hi. Do you want to introduce yourself to the group? Candace, you're muted. Could you unmute?
Truly, honestly, it's as if I haven't been on a Zoom call for 24 hours straight for 3 months. Hi, everybody. I'm Candace Wortman, Chief of Engagement and Operations at Outlier Media in Detroit, Michigan. And I come to fundraising out of necessity because I deeply believe in the work that we do. And we drew straws, and I got the short end of the straw. And so Sarah put me in charge of fundraising. But also, I was raised in a household of fundraisers. My mother was a Black Club president, so I have been asking people for money my entire life. And I'm really excited to be on this panel today with all of these folks who I deeply admire.
Great. Okay, so we've had a couple of conversations as a group over the past couple of weeks, and they've broken down into some major themes. And so we have some starting point sort of questions that I'm going to throw out, and panel, we can answer those questions however we want to, from the general to the very specific. So the first one, and as I think most of us know, that for a lot of foundations, it's not enough just to say that journalism is important and we want to fund journalism. So why should philanthropy fund your work? Or for Tracy, why do you fund the groups that you work with? And maybe since I just addressed you, maybe Tracy, do you want to take the first round at this?
Sure, I can certainly try. Why do I fund the organizations that I fund? It's because they are providing critical information and seeing the critical information needs of the communities that they serve. The Racial Equity and Journalism Fund focuses primarily on communities of color, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. So I was talking to someone about this earlier today. There's a lot of conversation about fixing what's happening at a lot of media organizations. I find that the folks that we invest in, they've already cracked that formula. They know they have the rest down, and they are providing. They're really serving the needs and meeting the needs of communities of color. So That's why I find the post we find.
Don't be shy. Terry, Candace, you want to jump in?
Well, it's interesting. The majority of the foundations who fund us actually don't have, journalism or funding media in, as part of their main portfolios or as a stated part of their mission. But what they've realized is that in many cases we cover something, whether it be education, healthcare, social justice issues, and that through lots of conversations and getting to know foundations and working with them, they've realized that they can further their mission and their agenda by funding our work. But with a couple of exceptions, almost there's really no one who has like this long track record of supporting media who's now supporting us.
And I would say for our end, there are two really important things. And the first one is that what we hear so often is about the future audience, right? This audience that has been underserved or unserved, depending on where you are. An outlier is a direct answer to that question. That is the only audience we care about. And not only do we care about them, but we work in collaboration with them to understand what their information needs are. And that's where our work is centered. Our work is directly dependent on our audience telling us what their needs are. And that's how we put together our beats. It's also how we determine what products we will build to serve that audience. But more than that, we're collaborative. And not collaborative in the way that many organizations have been that I have worked in, but in a way where we put equity at the very base of those collaborations. And so we get to work with all of the media organizations in town because we are not there to be competitive. We are there to inform. And we play well with others. So if that sounds like an organization that you want to fund, you can reach me at, no, I'm joking. But that is the reason why supporting Outlier is important, because we think about collaboration at the very base of what we do, but also because we build in collaboration with the audience that we serve.
I looked at the list and I don't think we have any funders on the call, so we can.
They'll watch after.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Yeah. There we go. I hadn't thought of that. Okay. So yeah, everyone be careful what you say. And I'll throw out a quick answer to that. I mean, we cover the transition to a clean energy economy, and so our funders are all in the climate and environmental space, but they see journalism as necessary, especially as legacy media are declining. Who's going to cover the energy efficiency bill in the Missouri legislature? So the need for advocates recognize that journalism is necessary in order to do their work. If you're operating in darkness, the advantage always goes to the people who are already in power. And so maybe we can also build off of this question, because we'll talk in a little bit about how we measure impact and show value. But in working with funders who have a specific sort of outcome in mind, how do you balance that with the need to uh, practice journalism? Or is there any conflict at all?
Ken, can you repeat that question for me?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, in terms of funders who fund our work have an outcome in mind, right? They have an objective, and that can sometimes, for some journalists, feel like a conflict, because how do we balance this question of, are we doing activism or are we doing journalism, or is that even a thing to be concerned about?
That sounds more like a Terry question, I think.
We've been fortunate in that we're very clear with the foundation that we work with from the beginning that it's sort of a one-way street. We do consider them partners and very much partners in our work. But at the same time, when they're funding us, it doesn't have an influence on what we report, on any lines of coverage. anything like that. And we've been very clear with that, but we haven't even had to really push that hard. There's been a lot of respect of that. I think that people have come to this understanding that we have to remain editorially independent and objective, and that's really what they want. If we start being, following everyone's pet projects and reporting all those things, then we're losing sight of what we are doing. And so, people have been very respectful of that. We've really been fortunate, and for the most part, the journalists aren't even really aware of which foundations are supporting us and everything else. We keep a pretty intact firewall between the funding and the journalism.
I would say the same
I
is true
think
for yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tracy.
no. There's a related question in the chat, but you answer, and we can circle back to that.
Okay. I was just going to say the exact same same thing is true for us, Terry. That I certainly don't have never experienced while I've been an outlier any issues with a funder asking us to change how we operate. As a matter of fact, I think we are funded because of the way that we operate, which is a joy to have be true, because I have been on the opposite end of that, where I have worked in a newsroom where there was a lot of changing of not necessarily how we reported, but what we were reporting on, what we would be focused on based on the kind of funding that we got. And I can tell you that was incredibly frustrating, especially for the folks in the newsroom who, were trying to do projects that got put on the back burner because of the way that the funding was coming in and the way that it had to, and the kind of reporting that had to be done because of that funding. So I've been in both situations, and I can tell you that this situation is much better.
So the question in the chat is, how do you, and it's directed to me, how do you distinguish coverage for people of color versus news coverage that focuses on civic, government, and information that is important to working people versus big business? So I want to take this opportunity to disavow us of some stereotypes and myths, I believe, that exist not only in this country, but in this industry. People of color, communities of color, are interested in government accountability. That's what these protests are all about. Government accountability, accountability of law enforcement. Communities of color care about healthcare policies and wage disparities. People of color care about civic engagement. They care about voting rights. Because you are a community of color does not mean you don't care about these issues. It also does not mean that these issues and the need for information on these issues for communities of color are being met through traditional news channels. And so by investing in news organizations led by and for people of color, we are meeting those needs. News organizations led by people of color are more trusted. They are in relationship with their communities at a much higher level than corporate-owned media. And I think that has been well established, well researched, and well documented. But because you are a community of color does not mean that you're not interested or in need of critical and quality information around government accountability. So if there's nothing else that I say during this session, or nothing else that you remember during this session, let's I hope focus on being really intentional about how we ask the questions. I'm happy to answer them, but understand how some of these questions can be loaded and might trigger some answers that don't really jive with what you're already thinking or feeling.
Tracy, thanks for that. And there's a new question in the chat that I think we'll get to when we start talking about recording and reporting impact, but I'm wondering if we ought to actually kind of jump ahead and then jump back to the question about cultural barriers within journalism and within philanthropy. And one of the things in our earlier conversations that we contrasted is for me being in an organization that's been that is white-led and dealing with foundations that are white-led, the climate and energy space is grappling with its own issues over equity and representation right now. it's been pretty straightforward. It's been a lot easier than it is for organizations led by people of color, or and also kind of newer startups in general. And so within the field of journalism, what are I wonder if we could expand on that topic a little bit on culture builders within journalism, and then within the philanthropy world that might need to change in order to sort of help build up some of these relationships with foundations. Does that make sense?
Are you talking to me, or are you talking?
I'm throwing that out there. I'm throwing that out for anyone, because I know you you just spoke very, very clearly about that, and it seemed like maybe since this was also part of our program to talk about, if you or Candace or Terry want to add anything to that. I mean, I can tell you too that and we'll get to this at the end too. Foundation funding is so much about relationships, and it's an insular world, and philanthropy needs to grapple with its own whiteness and sort of centered on. There's a parallel between journalism having this sort of imaginary view from nowhere, which is actually sort of a white perspective, and philanthropy having this objective view from nowhere and kind of patriarchal view of the world that's also from a white perspective. And I know we spent a lot of time talking about that. So if you, Candace or Terry, want to
I think I just think there's some thinking around funding and the notion of journalism that has erected some misunderstandings and some walls. I guess that's the best way to put it. News organizations led by people of color have been around for a very, very long time, and it was because folks were unable to find spaces or welcome in some white-led news organizations. That has led to less than 1% of funding going to news organizations led by people of color. That's why the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund was set up to begin with, because of the huge discrepancy in funding going to kind of large nonprofit news organizations versus hyper-local news organizations, and even less going to hyper-local news organizations led by people of color. I think, this comes down to two critical things, and that is a lack of trust. Communities of color are not alone in this at all. I think, as I mentioned yesterday, people in general have less trust in news and less trust in journalism. But communities of color truly has, and for good reason, has not trusted corporate-owned media for a very, very long time, and they've had these other places to turn to for information, quite frankly, mostly on the national level, but even more so now on the local level, because you have a lot of hyper-local news organizations cropping up now to serve. These are journalists who've been displaced out of corporate-owned media, and they are starting their own, but they're also legacy news organizations that have been underfunded for quite a while now. Who are serving these needs. They have the brand loyalty and trust, and already in relationship with the communities that they serve. And so I do think that you are seeing more funding turning its attention to those kinds of news organizations right now, especially in light of COVID-19 and the protests that's been happening around the country. So there are more and not just journalism funders are looking that way now, but you have a lot of funders who are not journalists, like as Terry mentioned, who are not journalists, have no background in journalism, but now want to invest in news for these communities. So it's been really interesting to see in the last few weeks.
I'll tell you that the last 3 months have been one of the most revealing months when it comes to funding for Outlier. This is the first year where people were knocking our door down to talk to us about funding us. But that was because we were in the middle of a traumatic moment. And the kind of reporting that we do, the communities that we talk to were the folks who were most impacted by not just the virus itself, but the many, many crises that popped up around the virus. Economic crisis, education crisis, mental health and abuse crises across the city and across all the cities that we worked with. We were doing that level of work before this year. We were doing that level of work before these last 3 months. And we were telling this story over and over again, but getting very little support from most foundations, right? Many who would not even talk to us. And now that they see this crisis, we are now a crisis team. And that is difficult at best. It also means that next year is no way in the world that I could build a budget based on what happened this year, because you still aren't funding us because of the kind of work we're doing. You're funding us because it's the cool thing to do right now, right? But not because you trust Candace and Sarah to run and operate an organization, right? Because that's still not true. Most people do not trust Sarah and I to operate and run this organization. And so really what we have to do is not just sell the work that we do, also sell ourselves as professionals over and over and over again. And that means that if, one organization has 2 jobs when it comes to selling themselves, we've got like 5 jobs. And it is an unfortunate reality for most organizations run by people of color.
Yeah, Terry, did you have anything to add on that?
Well, I think there are a couple of key words in there, especially I think that so much of the foundation work that we do is about looking at the both short-term needs but long-term relationships, and there are often times where we've been talking to folks for years and trying to find that right fit, that right now suddenly the fit is perfect because and it's because we've been having these conversations. I always talk about philanthropy being an exchange of values, and we've been listening and hearing what foundations are interested in. We've been talking about our goals through our strategic plan, especially around diversity, and suddenly these things are coming together in a great way. But it's all, it goes back to these relationships. It is very hard to start, just going from, I think you called it, Ken, a relationship, the marriage metaphor, the dating metaphor. It's hard to get married on that first date. And so I think so much of what this is about is just, keeping an open dialogue so that when these opportunities, rise up, we've had the same thing where some foundations have called us, which is a great thing. And so, out of the norm to say, I know this is important to you. Can we talk about this? And I think that is just where you really treat these foundations as true partners, not just as cash machines, that you get these kinds of results.
Yeah, and this feeds into, so there are a couple of questions in the chat that are sort of related to how do you convince funders to fund your work, and Terry kind of hit on that briefly, and then I promise we'll talk about also how to, like, some tactics to initiate those conversations and relationships too before we're done, because that's the first step. So we're kind of going backwards. But let's sort of two threads to this conversation, and one is that this is actually a thing in philanthropy too that I know a lot of funders are trying to grapple with, where boards tend to move from one shiny object to the next, and we want to drop a one-time infusion of funding and have you solve a problem and then we're going to go away, or we will fund the work, but we don't want to fund overhead. We don't want to fund staff salaries. And some of the bigger foundations are getting much better about that. But I wonder if anyone wants to talk about their experiences with, in terms of working with foundations to create longer term support instead of just sort of one time, as Tracy described it, as crisis funding. or the new shiny thing that they want to fund and then walk away from, you know.
Right. So I dropped that link in the chat, and I think it's really good context for that question you just asked. Reg, we provide general operating support to our grant partners. And so it's not just this new and shiny thing, and equity is what we do. So that's built into our work. I guess I'm getting lost in the question a little bit. But in terms of like, how do you attract our attention, I guess, is that the best way to kind of rephrase your question? Ken,
yeah, I apologize for the nebulous questions. I'm trying to sort of find the seams in the conversation to kind of keep them rolling. But one issue that sort of came up with what Terry was saying was that foundations can kind of sometimes be in and out, and it tied in directly with what you said too about they're interested right now, and then things will shift, and then they'll move on to something else. And so how do you forge those long term?
So the other thing that's built into the work that we do is capacity building. Our funders, our donors, really want to see kind of like long-term sustained support in order to help these news organizations grow. So our approach is really kind of like fundamentally different from how other funders might approach funding journalism. So the Reg Fund is kind of an anomaly in that respect. We're not one of these flash in the pan kind of investment approaches. We want to help support that organization. In order for this fund to be sustainable, we recognize that the organizations that we invest in have to become more sustainable. So that is how we approach this. But yeah, I'll leave it to someone else, maybe a funder on the call who has a different approach might be able to weigh in on that.
I wonder, Terry or Candace, if you have any experience or thoughts on having funders who, because I think we've all had a mix maybe of both, of funders who are in it kind of for the long haul and those that are just maybe doing one-off projects, and if you have any experience with those types of situations.
We definitely have one funder who for sure is in it for the long haul. God bless them. And that shows up not just in how they fund us, but also in the kind of key conversations that they have about us, about the strategy behind how we become what Tracy is talking about, right? Like, how do we become a sustainable organization that is itself in for the long haul? So the funder that I'm talking about in particular has invested not just money, but also time in helping us to find consultants and helping us to find folks who can work with us on the business end, on the strategy end. And so that's about much more than a one-time gift. That's about helping us put legs on this organization so that it is here, in 5 or 10 years, so that one day I can become, a Terry Quinn and be able to raise big money. So, but you need big strategy in order to do that.
And we've been fortunate that for the most part, knock on wood, because you never take any of it for granted, is that once we get someone in the fold of supporting us, I think we do a great job of over delivering and really focusing on stewardship. You're not just going to hear from me once a year when it's time to renew the grant. And so that we've had in the last year, someone who was giving to a very specific reporting beat who's now giving us a general ops grant. And I think that it's just through, really good stewardship, but really just putting the journalism in front of folks where we've turned what would have been maybe just a one-off into a long-term relationship. And so we really now, of course, we try to go for multi-year grants when we can. And if you have to find a silver lining, I think right now in the pandemic, it's just that I think it has reminded foundations that basic operational dollars are so vital to what we all do. And so hopefully, that reminder will stick for a long time. We also try to structure anything we do to make it sustainable. So if it's adding a new beat or something like that, we try to raise several years before we launch anything, because we don't want to be irresponsible with these dollars. We want to do great work with it.
I just want to quickly add on that, um, we don't do joyful work, right? So the work we do is not joyful, but our joy about that work is contagious. And we express and share that joy with funders constantly. And Terry is absolutely right. When I'm sending an update, it's not because I'm like, oh, well, let me make sure I let our funders know. It's because I'm genuinely excited because we are seeing real progress, and that progress comes from their support. And so it's just like if I'm sending a letter to someone who has given us a donation, or I'm updating folks in a newsletter, it's that same joy for the work that we get to do every day that I want them to understand, so that when we do get back to the table for that renewal, quite honestly, they already have everything in their hand to understand not just what we've been doing, but what the future looks like for what we will be doing.
And I think that's beautifully said. Thank you so much for that, Candace. My favorite grant partners are the ones who send me quick email updates about what they just accomplished, because I can then I don't have to think too hard. I don't have to work too hard. I can take that information, lift it directly from the email, and share it with my donor partners and say, hey, this is the kind of impact your money is having. So those are just great ways to develop a relationship with the funder. But before that even happens, before you even get to that point, you got to catch the funder's attention. And so I think a couple of questions are in the chat about how do you do that? How do you do that from the start? And I can talk about that a little bit, or I don't want to step over what Ken is the great job he's doing.
Well, I think we absolutely should get to that, and then also this seems like we're starting to get into ways that we actually show and measure impact, and then maybe we can go into that, and then towards the end, again, everyone's waiting what's the secret to start these relationships. I'm going to give you everyone a spoiler alert. There is no single magic bullet secret that we're going to lay out on you, but hopefully as we talk through sort of how things work on the back end, that this will help you as you approach and be prepared to start those conversations.
But Ken, I just wanted to add in though, because what Tracy just said reminded me of something I think that is pertinent to, how do you get started with other foundations? It starts with doing a good job with a foundation that you're already working with, because all of the foundations talk to each other. Am I right, Tracy? And so, so not only is it important to do a good job stewarding that foundation for multiple reasons, but they are also sometimes the best person to introduce you to the next funder. And so when we see a lot of questions in here about how you meet people, it's often I will look and see what a foundation is supporting, and then compare it to some other funders that I already have a relationship with, and say, hey, do you know this foundation? Can you introduce us? And no one has ever said no. And that kind of third party endorsement is just a great way to get started.
Yeah, I'll throw another layer onto that. That one of the ways we've been around, we've been around for 10 years, and a lot of our funders have been with us for that entire time, for an entire decade on this project. And one of the ways we do that is making ourselves indispensable. And we have a philosophy within Fresh Energy that if you can't be the best or second best at something, then you shouldn't do it. You should figure out who else can do it and let them take that lane. And what we do in terms of measuring impact and reporting that back, oftentimes it is getting testimonials from their other grantees also. And it's rare. The thing, nonprofits do not like to give credit to other nonprofits for anything, especially to a funder, because there's a competition for strict dollar, for a limited amount of money. So when you're able to show that 2 or 3 of their other grantees can point to what you're doing and say, yes, this is critical for our work and you should continue funding it, that's really one of the best sales pitches you can make to them. So 2 more kind of branches here. One is sort of initiating the conversation, and the second is recording impact, and how do you measure impact and report that back. So maybe we talk about that for a little bit. And then we have 18 minutes left before the room closes down, so we want to make sure we leave openings for questions. So I know we had some good conversation about what 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 do foundations want to see from you in your reports, and how do you record that and measure that and get that information to them. And whoever wants to.
So, kind of, I'll answer the first question first, and then the second half second. So, in order to, one of the, I think, the great things of launching a fund, this is the first year of the Reg Fund, so it's brand new, and we're just, people are just getting to know us. And so people are constantly coming up to me with questions, and I'm happy to answer. One of the best ways to get some time with a funder is if you're going to attend a conference like INN or whatever, and you say, hey, I saw you on the schedule. I wonder if I could grab a couple of minutes with you, before or after you give your talk or whatever. But it's like you're being a reporter. So be a reporter and do your research. Find out the kinds of things and organizations and people that they invest in. Find out something new that they might be thinking about investing in, and start a conversation, right? I come from the world of circulation and sales. You never, ever, ever want to start a relationship by asking someone to buy something. So the same rule applies to when you're trying to get funding from a funder. So you don't want to start off any conversation by, can you give me, or what can I, how can I get, funder? I'm not going to get mad about it or anything, but that's just not the best way to start a relationship. So you want to find something that you have in common. You want to find or identify a need that funder might have, or an interest that funder might have. And that's how you broach the conversation. And then after you have that initial conversation with a funder, you want to follow up with an email and just say, great talking with you about X, Y, and Z. And here's what we're doing to address. You raised this point in our conversation, or you raised this point at the conference. And here's what we're doing, because we're interested in the same issue. And here's how we are responding. So for me, that is an awesome way to start a relationship with a funder. When I still ask for money, but but when I approach new donors, I've done my research, I've done my homework, I've identified a need or an interest they might have, and here's how the grant partners in my portfolio are already meeting those needs or addressing that problem or that issue. And so I usher them in that way, and I try to start or engage a relationship from that standpoint. And Terry, I think Terry said it beautifully. This is kind of like a stewardship, right? And so you want to nurture that relationship. You want to grow something long term. I'll stop there.
Tracy, I agree. And it's not only attending things and introducing yourself, but as I mentioned to y'all the other day, we also try to get our leaders and our speaking in public as much as possible to different groups. And I can't tell you how many times, based on that, that speech, or just opening eyes to what we do, how that's resulted in new relationships and eventually new gifts. And it's also just about setting us up as the experts, on, policy issues, and an indispensable resource. And I think that I try to follow up quickly with just, I know you are interested in education. Did you know that we, manage this huge education database? Really trying to establish expertise and what we're doing, for the community before going in to ask for the contribution.
Exactly.
What Terry and Tracy are saying is absolutely correct. So much of this work happens in lobbies, at conferences, in between sessions. And that's great for the folks that can go to those conferences and find a way to sacrifice to get to those conferences. But I'm always concerned about the organizations who don't even know these conferences exist, who cannot afford to get to them. I have spent a lot of money out of pocket getting to conferences because I knew that I had to be there, because it is where we were going to figure out how to pay for the next 6 months to 9 months of Outliers work. So that's just maybe a pushback to funders, right? To really rethink how we grant access to ourselves, or I shouldn't say ourselves because I'm not a funder, but to yourself. Because there are a lot of folks who don't get to come to those tables, who don't even get to get in the room in those tables. But I would just say, yes, speaking absolutely positively works. That means you should have more diverse panels. I'm looking directly in the camera now because I want to make that an extra point. But I'm a little fired up these days. But also, I think that one of the things that has really worked for us is that we're fortunate enough to be able to collaborate with other newsrooms across the country. And often, because of those collaborations, we're introduced to funders we would never know about because they do work in those particular states, or they're heavily located in those places. And so we've been really able to take advantage of those partnerships and to have conversations with those funders after we have fulfilled the contractual obligations of our MOU with that work. We're able to go back in and say, well, if you're interested in this work, we've got an offer for you, because we can continue to do this with other folks in your state. Also, Michigan's a wonderful state and you should fund work here too. So never forget that when you're working on partnerships and when you're working in collaborations, if you don't have relationships with the funders who are paying for that, they're paying for your work as well. And you should be having conversations with those folks.
I'll throw out really briefly.
Can I just say thank you to Candace for that, for making that observation about, yes, we should rethink the way people have access to us, because that is very, very true. I think as funders, we have to kind of rethink all of how we do our work as well. And so, yeah, it's hard for us because, especially when you're a small funder, it's hard to respond to every email. But if you have a relationship, or if maybe you have a connection to that funder, you can ask a person for an introduction. I do get emails and I do try to respond to all of them, but it is very, very difficult. But, there are ways you can kind of help your work stand out as well by kind of making it in the subject line, making the link to what that funder is interested in, or the type of work that funder is interested in. So just to say that, just to make space, and thanking Candace for making that observation and pushing us.
Yeah, I would second that, and I wanted to throw out briefly, because I know we talked about that. This is a way that established, I guess, organizations that have more robust relationships within the philanthropy community, like the one I work at, can be more anti-racist in our work, is by helping to forge those relationships and not hoard those contacts, which is, our business incentive is to not introduce more competition. But we need to really, as a white-led organizations, we need to think of ways that we can help expand those relationships as well, because this work is really important. So we've got about 9 minutes left. Do we want to go to Q&A out of the chat, or do we?
Yeah, there was one question about new donors who don't have experience in journalism, and how is the conversation different with those donors versus funders who are already in the journalism space. And I would be interested in hearing what Terry and Candace say. And
yeah, Terry, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, and it sort of dovetails with another one that's, asked if it's the same with major donors, and for the most part it is. These are similar conversations. And, I think it goes back again to what I, was talking about earlier, just that either with an individual or with a foundation, when you at first start by listening or doing your research, all these other things, and you find out what they're really interested in, and you're able to show either from past work or if you're a startup just by your intentions or your roadmap, you can establish that relationship and sort of show that by funding our work, you're funding, shining a light on these issues for whether it's a community, whether it's a region or a state, national. And I think that more and more people are getting that, between the conversations around news deserts and everything else, or just through civic engagement. In Texas, we talk a lot about Texas exceptionalism, but when it comes to voter turnout, we're right there at the bottom. And so, I try to call out different issues that we're trying either directly or indirectly through our journalism to address. And we're usually able to find common ground with someone who has not funded journalism previously. And so there's still a few foundations that we've been talking to for 5 years who haven't quite realized or gone as far as seeing how they can move from direct service funding to thinking of us. But on the flip side, I mentioned this the other day, that I've had more than one more traditional direct service provider say to me, we're not going to stop our direct service grants. But what we've also realized is if we don't start addressing systemic issues, then we're never we're just putting a Band-Aid on these issues year after year. And we feel like through your journalism, we can actually, you're helping shine a light on these major issues and getting to real change rather than just continuing these things and kicking the can down the road. And when it comes to impact, it's sometimes a challenge because many of these foundations, as we've discussed, aren't set up for metrics that have to do with journalism, especially if they're a healthcare provider or something like that. And so you just have to work really closely with the grant officers to figure out a common vocabulary and a way to fulfill what they're hoping to show to their boards, but you also have to do a little bit of educating to them about what's important as far as measures go and how we assess impact.
And there's a key point in there too, is that maybe if people aren't or kind of new to this don't realize that the program officer that you're talking to, their job is to sell your work to their board.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
your advocate and your ally, and so you need to be upfront and honest and
Yes.
very frank with them about what they need to see.
Yeah, that's so true. In fact, I had been communicating right when the pandemic started with all of our grant officers and just showing them what we were doing and all of this. And we were up for renewal with the foundation. And the grant officer called me and said, we are transitioning this year to only funding COVID-19 related grants. And I had this moment of kind of, taking a deep breath. And he said, but based on everything that you've been sending me, I've advocated to our board that you were part of addressing the pandemic, and they agree with me. And he made the case for us. We didn't have to.
Don't lie to your grant officer and don't lie to your spouse, and you'll have a really happy life. Truly.
Amen. Amen. I talk with my grant partners all the time. Tell me everything. Don't let me be surprised. As a program officer, you do not want to walk into a board meeting or your donor table and be surprised. So, protect me, fight for me. We are each other's best friends. Like you said, don't lie to your spouse and don't lie to your program officer. That's very true. I think that's the headline for this attack. That's the name of this session now.
I want to throw one more brief thought out too on that question too, is that when you're approaching a foundation, don't try to sell journalism. Sell what journalism does. And I think that requires some deeper thought. Journalism informs the public. Okay, why? So what? Who are you informing and what do you want them to do with that information? And it requires us to get out. Martin yesterday just sort of denounced the myth of objectivity. I think all journalism is a political act. and you're giving people information to empower them to participate in their democracy.
Right.
What we do, we bust myths. We tamp down misinformation. We elevate underrepresented perspectives or underrepresented voices. We normalize a change that some people want to point out as being scary. Things like that that will fit into their broader communication strategy. That's what you're trying to sell.
Yeah.
My job is not to fix a news organization. We cannot save all news organizations, and I'm not even trying to. What I do want to do as a program officer and as a fund is I want to serve communities. And so the grant partner or potential partner that comes in talking to me about communities and how they are meeting the information needs of communities, that's where we start. Mm-hmm. We can't start with fixing a news organization. We have to start with the community, put that at the center of what we're doing, not only in terms of journalism, but also in terms of funding.
Sorry, we got 2 minutes left, so maybe Terry and Candace, did you want to throw any last thoughts here before I'm done.
Well, I'll add in real fast to that we don't have a paywall on our site, and at the basic core level, I think especially for people who support us, the fact that we talk actively about providing all of this information to anyone who wants to access it, and how important it is for anyone around this giant state to have access to quality, nonpartisan information, that at the core appeals to many of our donors. Just that idea of providing equal access to this information.
Candace, last thoughts?
Last thoughts. Find funders that match your mission. It is incredibly important. If your mission matters to you, then you need to match your mission with your funders. And then also, be joyful about the work that you do and express that joy. Tell people about what you do. I think that I find a lot of time that journalists and people who work in journalism are scared to brag on the work that they do. Don't be scared to brag on your work. Let people know how you are serving your community, because in order for you to keep doing that work, somebody has to know you're doing it. And don't be scared to approach people. Don't be scared to tell people about what you're doing, because so much of this is just selling the incredible work that is important, that your community needs. So go out and tell somebody why they should be funding it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Candace, Terry, Tracy. Wonderful. Great group. I've learned so much from all of you. Hit us up offline if you have further questions we weren't able to get to. Thanks, everyone, for joining this conversation.
Thank you all.